Question asks us the extent to which, and to evaluate the extent to which, the DUP and Sinn Féin have controlled the political process in Northern Ireland since 2007. After a protracted discussion of some 8 months, mainly behind the scenes, a draft programme for government was finally announced on the 17th of November 2011. The media chose to focus upon Peter Robinson's view that, after a term of stability between 2007 and 11, the public would be expecting delivery from the executive, and Martin McGuinness, who talked about the need to raise the bar of expectations of what the government could do. Whilst other party leaders did get their soundbite, there was tacit recognition that it was only when Sinn Féin and the DUP had done a deal that any deal would be announced. Coverage in the press, TV, and from respected academics like Rick Wilford all seem to draw the reader of this answer and its writer to the conclusion that the extent to which Sinn Féin and the DUP control the political process is at its very least significant and probably most likely overwhelming. In order therefore to examine the question, certain aspects of it must be honed in on. So we will look at the performance of the parties at the polls since 2007, since this is an obvious line of inquiry when measuring dominance. Also for consideration will be the way that the rules of the political game under the consociational model, that is the Good Friday Agreement, operates in relation to Sinn Féin and DUP's exercise of power. These rules, based upon segmental autonomy of the communal nature, have since 1998 and particularly since 2007, when Sinn Féin and the DUP first had the opportunity and electoral mandate to divvy up the bulk of the executive posts, tend to be seen in sharp relief. They have attended to allow these two parties, who unlike their coalition partners can exercise their veto, because they meet the terms of the St Andrews Agreement, which gave any party with 3 or more ministers, which Sinn Féin and the DUP have, the right to block the move of the other party, or large party, or indeed the ambitions of smaller parties. Alex Atwood, for instance, wanted to reduce the number of local councils to 15, but a Sinn Féin DUP behind the scenes carve-up meant that he was undermined and sidelined, and the programme for government went ahead with the promise to legislate down to 11 councils. Next, a consideration of the extent to which the parties are like conjoined twins, and in some senses dependent upon each other for survival. Furthermore, the other parties who work within the system, especially the UUP, SDLP, and to some extent the Alliance Party, and their take upon the Sinn Féin and DUP power grab, or carve up, or whatever term best fits their critique. Control or dominance of any political process partly depends upon events outside Northern Ireland. And as Patrick Murphy, writing the Irish News about the PFG for 2011, noted, any ambitions of the executive and the lead parties, DUP and Sinn Féin, to create, say, 25,000 jobs must be seen in the light of George Osborne's decision in the Autumn Statement to cut further the subvention of money to Northern Ireland. As such, politics in Northern Ireland is always affected by events in the Republic of Ireland, Europe and the US, and therefore control of the process by any party or parties is hardly one of dominance, particularly at a time when public opinion has largely a negative view of politicians' ability to extract Northern Ireland from the global economic downturn. Furthermore, the reality of the legislative process since the inception of power sharing and even since 2007 has been one of limited joined-up government, to borrow from Rick Wilford's analysis. Much of the legislation has been so-called parity bills, which would have happened with or without the DUP and Sinn Féin presiding over 9 of the 13 ministerial posts. For parties with so much supposed control, there is still a huge blockage in the legislative system over such things as an Irish Language Act, the regeneration of the Maze site, a Bill of Rights, and of course the post-11 education debacle. Even where progress has been made recently over the reform of local government, it has been less about control and more about backroom deals and fudges. So, if judged by their legislative control in this respect, the DUP and Sinn Féin arguably do control the process, but neither party has significant ability to determine the outcome on its own. It is even possible to argue that though they seem to have dealt mortal blows to their intra-community rivals, the UUP and SDLP respectively, the need for them to find compromises, not unlike the policies of the same said rivals in the first period of devolution, for fear of going into political limbo, as happened between 2002 and 2007, has led some like commentator McPhilty of Slugger O'Toole fame to suggest, and others like academics Cathy Gormley-Heenan, that they enjoy, that is Sinn Féin and the DUP, less control or dominance and are in fact power snared by the system towards a moderating of their preferred policies, borrowing very much from Brendan O'Leary's idea that something like the consociational model used for Northern Ireland will lead to those, shall we say, the extreme parties exercising moderation through responsibility. Basically, give them power and actually they will have to moderate their policies and find solutions. Yet another determinant of how powerful the DUP and Sinn Féin are is in reality that they are essentially deadly political opponents with diametrically contradictory constitutional and ideological positions, policy differences right across the board mainly. In some ways the question here misses the mark. It would be more accurate to say that the DUP and Sinn Féin wrestle almost on a daily basis, in line with what Robinson called a battle a day, to block the other or extract a concession. Sinn Féin, for instance, stayed away from the plenary executive meetings for 154 days, and the DUP effectively refused to discuss executive matters whilst the devolution of policing and justice wrangle dragged on. This hardly smacks of DUP and Sinn Féin control, and rather would be better described as a lack of control. Hardly surprising that when Rick Wilford came to sum up the performance of the executive between 2007 and 2011, he stressed survival and stability, suggesting that its survival was, as it has been since 1999, somewhat in doubt. So in this respect, the DUP and Sinn Féin don't so much dominate as dispute the political process. In some ways it would be said that the mutual veto was given to the two leading parties via the Hillsborough Agreement in 2010, when devolution of justice and policing was being discussed, has not created dominance by the two parties as much as it produced the politics of deadlock. Jonathan Tong from the University of Liverpool points to the way that while Sinn Féin and the DUP dominate the process, they are effectively cancelling each other out politically, because though they can attain some consensus on such things as deferring water charges and corporation tax, there has been little or no progress on key aspects of cohesion, sharing and integration, CSI Northern Ireland or North of Ireland. As he says, the cohesion, sharing and integration strategy appeared to oscillate between integrationist and separate but equal visions. Meanwhile, the number of peace walls physically dividing Protestant Unionist and Catholic nationalist communities has continued to grow. Parades issues remained unresolved, and an obvious lack of cross-community consensus. 48% of Protestants believe the Orange Order should be able to march without any restrictions, compared to 0.3% of Catholics. 72% of Catholics believe the order should not be allowed to march through nationalist areas. If Tong is to be believed, the control that the two parties here have is almost dependent upon them reinforcing the existing divisions that lie in society. This was highlighted at a lower level in the political food chain in the dispute over the actions of the Lord Mayor of Belfast, Niall O'Donoghue, with regard to the snubbing of an army cadet at a Duke of Edinburgh award ceremony, and all the events that then followed and dominated the local media for a week or so. The two main parties seem less to control the political situation, but to be controlled by it, and arguably their strength depends upon the strength of the other. It has become a strangely symbiotic relationship, the survival of the DUP depending upon their voters' dislike of Sinn Féin, and vice versa. Consequently, threats by Peter Robinson to resign over the prison officer's badge issue, Barry McElduff speaking up for the Loughgall 8, and disputes about when the Union flag should fly over public buildings still very much punctuates the politics of Northern Ireland, and again allows the two ends of the political spectrum to dominate in what is seen largely as a zero-sum politics, in which a DUP gain is matched by an equal Sinn Féin loss, and again vice versa. The Good Friday Agreement and St Andrews had both designed a form of coalition government almost unique in the world, and even Brian Fein accepts that Belgium and Lebanon, where consociational systems are used, don't quite operate the ideas that were put down by consociational models founder Arnd Lipfjord in a way that Northern Ireland does. It is an arrangement where coalition was effectively mandatory and where there was little sense of collective responsibility amongst the parties, and certainly none of the rights a British or Irish Prime Minister would have to determine who is in or what is out of government. Therefore, it was hard to sack a minister, and whilst Peter Robinson has reshuffled his own ministers, he has no say over the ministers of the other parties. The strange arrangements of the oath as a First Minister and Deputy First Minister perhaps worked on the surface under Paisley and McGuinness, at least for the cameras, the so-called Chuckle Brothers. But the Robinson-McGuinness relationship is much more one of tension and bad body language. So the DUP and Sinn Féin can't control each other, and when criticism was levelled, for instance, at Conor Murphy over the handling of the winter freeze of 2010-11, and when conflicts of interest were levelled at Arlene Foster and her husband's personal interests in the fracking of rocks in Fermanagh to produce gas, neither could face the real pressure to resign, unlike, say, the case that occurred roughly at the same time when Liam Fox got entangled with his special advisor and had to stand down. It could be argued that the same applies in the current Conservative Lib Dem coalition, but the vital difference is that every election in Northern Ireland to date has not been about choosing a government, but essentially rearranging the chairs around the largely same two-party-led executive table. Earlier, the views of the junior partners in the coalition were mentioned, and certainly here the likes of Alistair MacDonald and Tom Elliott would echo the sentiments of the question. Whilst, for instance, Sinn Féin and Katrina Ruan could abolish the transfer test, the DUP and General Unionist bloc on the executive could easily block her developing legislation to replace it. Consequently, the gridlock continued and continues. Academically, this view has the support of Paul Bew, who has long contended that the consociational model does not deliver rational government, and that therefore extreme parties like the DUP and Sinn Féin cannot really govern at all or share power given their polar opposite ideological positions. It was only with parties like the SDLP and the Ulster Unionist Party that the model could deliver. In fact, Dolores Kelly, now Deputy Leader of the SDLP, remarked back in 2009 that, quote, executive business in the Assembly has practically dried up, leaving us with recycled motions not worthy of a sixth form debating society, unquote. Whilst her position in the SDLP might smack of sour grapes, the fact that so little by way of legislation has come forward, and that even decisions over victims commissioners involve grand compromises, indicates that tensions, conflict and dispute have run right across the Executive Committee since 2007. Again, this is less like control and more like a battle a day, and indeed the gridlock that was referenced earlier. The UUP and the SDLP, if answering this question, and to a lesser extent probably the Alliance Party, would subscribe to the carve-up two-party control model. Sometimes cosy storm and carve-up is the expression they use. Consequently, there has been talk from time to time, and especially post the 2007 elections, about going into opposition. However, as Alex Kane points out, the mechanisms of the Good Friday Agreement don't really allow for a paid opposition, and the operation of Dawn, which underpins it, the supposed safeguards such as petitions of concern, weighted majorities, and the checks and balances of the committee system, depends upon the actual grand coalition idea, even if the SDLP and UUP have seen this as less than grand since they were effectively marginalised in 2007. The SDLP in any case were the architects of the arrangements, and therefore going into opposition, although mooted by the likes of Conal McDevitt, is unlikely. The SDLP have voted against the budget on occasion, and the UUP have voted against the devolution of policing and justice, but nothing really significant has happened. No avail, no avail. Any analysis of this question must recognise that control depends upon the electoral mandate achieved by the parties. And on the surface, both the DUP and Sinn Féin have improved their position ever since they surpassed their community rivals around 2002-2003. Tong puts an interesting slant on this. The 2011 Assembly election allowed the DUP and Sinn Féin to confirm their hegemonic positions within their respective ethnic blocs. Amongst Unionists, the DUP maintained its lead over the UUP, which had been evidenced in 2003, while Sinn Féin did likewise over the SDLP amongst Nationalists, a pattern evidenced even earlier in 2001. Sinn Féin entered the election buoyed up by the party's success, 10% of the vote and 14 seats in the Irish Republic's elections earlier that year. In Northern Ireland, Sinn Féin is seen as the most effective voice for Nationalists by 61% of the electorate, compared to only 12% saying the SDLP. The UUP dropped its ineffective 2010 general election alliance with the Conservatives, but still performed poorly under its new leader Tom Elliott. If control is to be measured by these figures and facts, then the extent to which this has happened electorally is considerable. However, because the Good Friday Agreement does not really permit voluntary coalition, we should not overplay their hold in what is combined 60% of the vote, because there are still 4 executive departments in the hands of other parties. And though solo runs may not be out, the likes of Stephen Farry can still make decisions in higher education that are significant. In other words, the DUP and Sinn Féin may dominate, but that domination is tempered by the conditions of power sharing and détente. And as long as the other parties continue to take their portfolios, as they have a right to under this system of détente, then this control is always less than complete. In conclusion, there is no doubt that critics of the Good Friday Agreement, like Jim Allister, would immediately cite the dominance of the DUP-Sinn Féin nexus, with particular emphasis on too much power in the hands of Sinn Féin. The junior coalition partners are significantly so unhappy with their powerless position that they continue to contemplate going into opposition. For some, like Cathy Gormley-Heenan, there is the view that all parties are effectively power-snared. This means that whilst the main players, the DUP and Sinn Féin, are so dependent upon the whole project working, that they will usually find some way to do a deal or park a problem, and do not as such dominate, but are controlled by the dynamics of the consociational model, with all its democratic weaknesses with regards to dominant government, but also its strengths in not allowing any group really to dominate. It is probably still part of the legacy of a conflict situation, which was seen one-party rule of the kind that ran Northern Ireland from 1921 to 1972, eventually replaced with a system of not so much two-party rule as two parties cancelling each other out, whilst the other main unionists and nationalists bemoan a system that tends to marginalise them, but one which for the UUP allows them at least a ministerial position and some limited power, and for the SDLP a great fear of walking away from a system of government that they are keen to remind everyone that they are the main architects for. And this is even true, even if it has become something like a Frankenstein monster for them. The overriding sense of frustration of the electorate, who increasingly have lost faith in the whole system and its ability to deliver, is countered by the inherent importance of making sure that the other side doesn't get in. So, while stability and relative peace may have been achieved, issues mentioned earlier like CSI have not, and thus leave the DUP and Sinn Féin in something like a loveless marriage, together more than in control or in domination of politics.